Hello everyone, I'm Psychotic, and that's also my screen name. Today we're taking a look at turrets and which ones might be right for you. Like our weapons video, we're doing an in-depth exploration of stats in the hopes that you can answer the question by yourself by the end of the video. Now, I still stand on the fact that our loadout is a profoundly personal thing. Everyone plays differently, so today we're going to look at all of the turrets, their DPS for shields, hull, and total, and their rotation speeds and range by faction and by size. I've added chapters to the video to make it easier to skip sections you're not interested in if you don't care about math or certain factions, or if you just want to revisit it later and it makes it easier to come back and check something out. I will point out my preferences and the changes that I made in my usual loadouts based on the math. Please remember that while your choices are not wrong, neither are mine. Anything is viable. It all depends on what you're trying to get out of your equipment and what feels best for you. Whether you want the highest numbers possible, the easiest to use, or the least maintenance is ultimately a choice for you to make. If you learned anything useful today, or if you have a good time, please don't be afraid to drop a like. If you're feeling friendly, maybe go ahead and subscribe. But either way, let's go ahead and get into it. Also, flashbang warning for our light-sensitive viewers. All right, so here we are. The first thing that we're going to go over is the layout a little bit here. As you can see, I've got them separated by slot size, all the large, all the medium, and then we have, this is everything together, and then we have the ones that are just by faction. And I did split, I didn't leave the faction in the name on these ones, I put it in a faction column for easier reference for me when I was making the spreadsheet. One of the other things that we need to pay attention to is missile damage. So everywhere that we have damage from missiles, it is based on the heavy variant and Mark II where available. So if they don't have a Mark II, then it's the Mark I. All of them have heavy, so it's the heavy values. None of them are the light values. So if you want to slap lights in your mediums and go after fighters, your numbers are going to be a little bit lower, just as a heads up. I did remove the mining turrets because, yeah, you shouldn't be fighting with mining turrets. I mean, you can, but it's mostly for the memes. I also removed the Kaak and the Xenon weapons since we can't use them. So if we get into our math, we've got our damage is raw. So the shield damage and the hull damage is taken straight out of the encyclopedia, complete raw damage. The total damage is the shield damage and the hull damage added together divided by 2. Makes sense. It's the average damage. And that mostly with turrets doesn't have much of a difference. There are only a handful, and we'll get into the color differentiations later. But everything that's green, the average is, or the total is going to be the same as either or. Our DPS is our damage times our rate of fire. So if we look up here, we got rate of fire times shield damage for shield DPS, same for hull damage. And then for total DPS, we went with the average of these two. Again, just simple math. Our tracking score is something that I added in. It doesn't actually appear in any of the encyclopedia stuff. So I wanted some way to differentiate not just the rotation speed differences, but also the ranges. Because if you take a circle, they're going to be moving slower the further out they are around a circle. So your rotation speed can afford to be lower and still be equivalent if they can start tagging things further out. So I wanted some way to reflect that. So what we did is we took the rotation speed times the range and then divided it by 100 to give us a single digit number with some decimals behind it. Just make it a little bit more readable. So I feel like it gives us a good feel. The closer in a ship is, the faster you want your turrets to turn. The further out a ship is, the slower they can turn and still be okay. So that I just wanted some way to differentiate those. The weapon output is what the encyclopedia shows as weapon output. In a lot of cases, I thought that it was the overall DPS, and I thought it was going to make my life easier. The first couple of things that I encountered were the bolts and the pulse, and it matches what our total DPS equation gives us for weapon output damage. But if we look at some of these other ones, they are not the same. Like this, I got 311, they have 315. This, I got 246, and they have 123. And I noticed in some of these, like this one, we have 159.5, but it's shield heavy. So the shield to hull ratio is over 1, so it's more shield than hull damage. And it's showing 220, which is the amount of shield DPS that it puts out, but it doesn't account for the hull DPS. So I'm not entirely sure what this number is. I just put it in there for posterity and transparency so that you guys can see what's going on. It did wind up even for the bolts and the pulse, so I'm not entirely sure. The ones that are highlighted in yellow are ones where there is no rate of fire in the encyclopedia, and I didn't want to try and time it when we're talking, 0.2 seconds in some of these cases. So I decided to just copy their weapon output damage over, even though it shouldn't be that. I just wanted to highlight that I'm not entirely sure what the DPS on these is because we don't have a fire rate. So our DPS here is not necessarily what the total DPS is. These are just straight over from these. Our green numbers are where the hull DPS and the shield DPS are the same. So the average is just straight across 1.0. The yellow numbers are the ones where they take ammunition. The red numbers are the ones where hull is greater than shield, and you can see because the number and the ratio is less than 1. And the blue numbers are where the shield is greater than the hull. So they get blue numbers and they're usually over 1. And the purple numbers are AoE. And I did these in purple with a blue highlight because they are blue numbers, but they're also purple numbers, and I didn't know how to differentiate clearly. So that's what we went with there. And then we have some more AoE down here with the flax, but they are even. They're a 1.0, so they don't have the backlit. Now, if we get into our argons, so I was under the impression, and have been since the way back when I was a little nooblet, that the Argon turrets shot further than everybody else. And that is kind of true, but not really. The range, if we look at these, the Talati are, or I'm sorry, not the Talati, the Paranid are actually further out than the Argons. So this is Paranid, this is Argon. And you can see everybody else has 8.6, except for the Split. The Split always have less range, but they have more damage. That's how they make up for it. So if you look at the Split DPS versus everybody else's. Now, the Paranids have longer range by 0.3 kilometers, but they have a drastically slower rotation speed. So if we look at the difference in score between them and the Argon, it's huge. The Argons are double, a little over double the score for tracking between, even though the Paranids have greater range, the difference in rotation speed is not enough to make up for the difference in range. And that makes sense. I mean, if you take, the difference between 8.9 and 8.6 is 0.3, and then the difference between 19 and 29 is 20, but you would have to do it by ratio to make it fair, which is where our multiplication came in. So this is what we came up with, and it is clearly better to use the Argon ones. And I might change the Paranid ones because I have a tendency to set them for large ships first and for tackling stations. So I think in the case of like our Station Smasher fleet and our Boron playthrough, it might actually be a good idea to slap the Paranid ones in there just so that they can hit the station from further out. Because the gun range on the Asgard is pretty decent too, so I think between the two, that would give us more hitting power and less danger. But for ships that are fighting other large ships, it's probably going to be better to go with the Argon just because the rotation speed's a little bit better, even though you lose, 300 meters on range. Anyway, Argons. So if we look at the total damage for our mediums, I don't like using ones that require ammunition. If you do, that's fine. No shade. Just know that your dumbfire are always going to be higher damage than your tracking, but your tracking are also going to be, generally speaking, either further range or rotation, but also they track ships, so that's important. The damage difference between the missiles is significant. And then in plasma, and this tracking is not, obviously, dumbfire don't track your target, so that's not tracking in that sense. It's again the rotation speed and the range compared. As far as getting into the energy weapons where you don't need ammunition, we are looking at the plasmas are always going to be top of the pack just because they are the highest DPS, period, end of story. The problem is their travel speed is extremely slow and their range is extremely far out, so it is not super difficult for enemies to evade the plasma fire. So it's always nice to have some plasmas on there for dealing with heavier ships, but I don't know that I would stack my mediums with them for that reason. As far as Argon equipment goes, I would probably deal with the Pulse, because the Shard are nice, but again, very, very short range. You're looking at 2.5 kilometers as opposed to 3.4. Like, that's almost another full kilometer. That's serious range difference. The other thing about the shards is, while they're not AoE damage, they do behave like a shotgun. So this is saying if all of the pellets hit, then you're at 290. If only half of the pellets hit, then you're only at half of that damage. So you want to be right up in their face if you're using these guys. And there are some ships that are absolutely suited to that, but I don't generally include them in my fleets. So I would lean more towards the Pulse in this particular case. The bolts aren't terrible, but I mean, that's less than half the DPS. The tracking is also significantly better on the Pulse. than it is on the bolts. In the large, I usually stack with plasmas because I generally have my mediums set to target medium and small ships, fighters, and then I generally have my larges set to target capitals. So that's where I generally thread my plasmas. In which case, Argon are my go-to for plasmas for the reasons previously stated. But if you didn't want to do that, that's also okay. You've got the 2 missiles are your next highest DPS, and then you've got the pulse. Again, the beams are there. I know some of you really like the beams. I don't care for the beams. I can't give you a reasonable DPS on them because we don't have a rate of fire in the encyclopedia. But the only thing I can say is if you are undecided on beams, maybe equip a ship with them and try it out, see what you think. If you like it, awesome. Start equipping beams. If you don't like it, that's fine too. Take it to a repair shop and swap them out for something else. But I do not care for the beams. I like the way they look, and I like the way that they pin targets because they are very, very fast. So it's almost instantaneous when you fire. But the range is crippling to me, and the accuracy and lower damage just don't make up for it for me. And I know some of you like them. That's not a judgment. Just they're not my go-tos. Boron. Now this is very important for us because we are trying to set up a boron fleet in our playthrough right now. And I did set up a boron fleet, but I did some loose, fast math, and I'm not entirely sure that I made the right choices. So we might be changing out some of that equipment. Looking at the larges, so these are AoE and they're shield based, and these are AoE and they're hull based. But if you look, 0.36 is essentially a third, and 2 is essentially double, so we're almost a triple. That's almost equivalent difference between 1100 and 400 and 200 and 500. Like that's almost an equivalence ratio difference. The thing is, I would want to stack heavy on the phase to offset how much more damage the pulse do. So I would do something like this is essentially twice the damage. So if you have 6 slots, I know none of them have 6 large slots, but if you had 6 slots for easy math, I would probably do 2 of these and 4 of these, just to make up that difference. If you have, 3 slots, maybe do 1 of these and 2 of these. And then you should be more or less even across your DPS field. They both have fairly decent tracking scores, particularly when you consider that this one is AoE as well. The rotation speed on this guy is nuts. The net launcher is really nice for its speed. So it's 7.1. The speed in the encyclopedia is given in meters per second, but range I wanted to do in kilometers, so I had to convert it, which is very, very simple if you're familiar with metric at all. So that's why there's 2 columns there. I just wanted to leave these in here because they came straight out of the encyclopedia. But the rate of fire on this guy is killer. So it's got a decent range, it's got a decent speed, and it actually has a phenomenal range and decent speed, but the rate of fire is just awful. And it does significant shield damage, and I'm pretty sure it's slow. I think all the boron stuff slows to some degree. It's just what degree it slows to. But the DPS is also awful, so I feel like it's better to go with these 2. As far as our mediums go, the arc turrets are probably the best bet. They're, well, actually, the ion pulse is probably the best bet because they are less shield than the arc turrets, and the DPS difference is not significant. You're only looking at, 17 damage difference? So it might be a better... Well, the tracking score is better on the arc, too. You know what? Probably the arc. Slightly more damage. And you've got the shield hull ratio is a little bit higher, which isn't necessarily good. The tracking score is very good. So I would probably do those. What's the difference here? So if 0.5 is 2 times the damage, and 2 is 2 times the damage, because... opposite sides of the spectrum, it might be good to do the same thing that we would do up here, except you could do an even amount, so you could do like 2 and 2 and use the only difference would be these are lower DPS by almost a third, but that's also an option there, is to do a little bit of a spread just to get some better results. We'll have to tinker with this. I think we might be changing around our boron fleet just because of this, just to see. Now the Paranids have hands down the best range on most of their weapons. The downside is their rotation speeds are absolute garbage compared to everybody else. And I mean, they have to keep the game balanced, so I get it. It's just not something that I would use on anything other than a strict Paranid playthrough, except maybe as on station killers or capital killers. Like their plasmas aren't necessarily terrible, just because the rotation speed's not going to matter if you have a large slow-moving ship or a stationary station. Other than that, missiles take ammo, so I won't use them, but here's the numbers if you want them. And then the pulse would be my go-to for Paranid weapons for large aside from the two exceptions that I mentioned, just because of the damage. But their tracking scores are very low. Their mediums aren't as bad. They've got a couple of good ones in here. Well, I guess the good ones mostly missiles, the tracking turrets, but the pulse isn't too bad. The bolt isn't too bad either, and significantly more DPS. So I think probably I would go with the bolt in this particular case. The shards aren't awful, but again, it's a shotgun, and the extra range is not necessarily useful in a shotgun because you want those pellets to hit. They're going to spread the further out they go, the further they're going to spread. I would probably go with the bolt in this particular case, and I don't know that I would use the medium plasmas just because they're slow moving, and particularly in this case, they're slow rotating as well. Yeah, they're higher damage, but you're going to have a hell of a time hitting fighters with those. Now, split weapons are almost always the highest damage, but they are also always the shortest range. So they are very much an in-your-face kind of weapon, and if that's your play style, then there you go. They also tend to have faster ships, but less shields and more hull. So they are all about go fast and blow stuff up. And I can get behind that sometimes. Sometimes you just have a bad day and you just want to blow things up. Their plasma turrets do phenomenal damage. It's one of the highest damage dealing turrets in the game. The downside is the range is only 6.9, whereas everybody else is looking at 8.9. So that's 2 kilometers closer that you have to be to fire those off. Their rotation speed's reasonable. It's pretty similar to everybody else's. The missiles are obviously next up. That's pretty standard. And then the pulse would be the ones that I would go with on large if I wasn't doing plasmas. I don't know, though, if I was doing a strict split-only playthrough, I would use their plasmas, but otherwise I would probably still fall back to the Argons. Or possibly the Baronet, because, that extra range is nice for things that you don't care about moving quickly. Their shard is going to have the same problem, but even worse. So you have to be 2.5 kilometers in just to fire the shards at them. And also the spread is still going to be an issue, but they do ridiculous damage. I would probably lean on the bolts. I think the bolts are going to wind up being slightly better. The flaks are nice. Flak cannons are very, very nice, and I do employ them almost religiously. The problem is the split flak ones, while they deal significant damage, their range is not good. I don't know why these aren't purple. They should be. That was just me being dumb, I think. I think I color-coded the ones on the main page after I'd already copied them by faction. I think that was my issue. But yeah, I would probably go with the bolt in this particular case. The pulse is a little bit low, and then the beams for reasons we stated earlier. The Talati have a pretty slow rotation speed, pretty decent range, decent damage. Like, they're pretty all around. They're not really the strongest in anything. They're traders. Their trading ships are where they really, really shine. They're trading and they're mining. Everything else is kind of comparatively. But if you're just going to be using Talati, again, I would aim for the plasmas for your large, set them to attack capitals first, etc. Otherwise, use the pulse. The difference between the pulse and the beam is, even if you look at just their numbers, and their number was very, very close to ours here. But if you look at the difference in these numbers, they're significant. The mediums, again, the missiles first, and then the plasma, I would skip medium plasma almost always, and same with the shard. I would go with the bolts in this particular case as well. The Terrans have some differing stuff. Their rotation speed doesn't look great at first blush, particularly compared to things like the Argons. So, when you're looking at, granted, these are upside down. Everybody else is large than medium. the Argons, I put medium than large. But, we're looking at 39 versus 19. Like, that's significance in degrees per second. That's 20 degrees per second faster that they rotate. They also don't have their own plasma turret, which is not good for the large, because I almost always, like I said, almost religiously use large plasmas for targeting capitals first. But you could slap some bolts in there. Looks like the bolts are probably going to be the best. The tracking scores are almost identical, but the DPS is undeniably higher, almost 100 points, which when you're talking between 300 and 400 is basically a quarter damage. Or I guess a third. It'd be a third more damage, but still, that's significant. The same thing here with our missiles being first, and then I would go with the bolt. They don't have a shard either, but I think bolts are going to be their way to go as opposed to the pulse. As far as the overalls go, like I said, I'm torn now between the Paranid and the Argon. I have always believed that the Argon had the further range, and it looks like the Paranid actually do. And I don't know that the rotation degree speed is going to hurt too awful bad because of the targeting capital ships first. None of the capital ships are exactly speedy. I don't know that 19 degrees per second is going to be particularly harmful with that, and it's certainly not going to hurt on stations. If you were trying to attack regular ships with it, it might be a problem. There's also the difference in DPS. It's not huge. It's only 40 points, which when you're looking at 1,000 is not that significant. Well, I guess it's 34 points. But still, I mean, 34 points is 34 points, especially if you can hit it an extra 300 meters out. It's a little bit of a safety margin for attacking stations at the very least, so they can't hit you back. If we weren't going to do plasmas for large, I would probably go with the large bolt from the Terrans just because the DPS is there. It doesn't have quite as good a rotation speed as like the large pulse from the Argons, but it's got the damage. The 19's painful, but it's got the damage. And again, your large turrets are mostly designed for going after larger ships. You can have them attack small ships, and mine, I have them set to capitals first so that they'll go after the others too, but they're often not going to land hits on the smaller ones, at least not the plasmas. These might be a different story, so you might actually want to go with something with a little bit better rotation speed, like maybe the Argon Pulse, just to keep up with the smaller ships. Boron stuff only goes on boron ships. Otherwise, these would also be a good option just because of the AoE. In this particular case, I very much like the flak from Argon. They do less damage than the flak from Lit, but again, the difference in range, I mean, it's 400 meters. Like, that's a significant difference in a fight on a medium turret, especially on a medium ship. On a large ship, probably not as noticeable, but on a medium, that is significant. But the AoE, like this number is misleading because it has the potential to be astronomically higher if it fires into a cluster of small ships. And I generally have these set to attack fighters first, so it's going to fire into clusters. The other nice thing is, even if it does shoot at a capital ship, you also have the AoE effect. If a cluster of turrets has 4 turrets in it and 1 shield on it, if you shoot an AoE thing like a flak into it, then that shield will take 4 separate hits based on the AoE damage from the same shot fired. So it can definitely help you with the larger ships as well. I don't know that I would specifically get them for the larger ships, but if it jumps in on the larger ship, it's not a bad thing. The other options are going to be up here, though, as far as probably the bolts. All of the bolts seem to be more or less the same, so I would go with the Argon just for the faster rotation speed. Possibly, yeah, because the difference in range is only going to be 100 meters. So I would definitely go with the bolts from the Argon. As far as medium turrets go, ultimately, which turret is right for you is a question only you can answer. I do hope that I've at least given you the tools that you can use to make an educated decision. If you guys are interested in shields and engines as well, please let me know. I know somebody wanted a whole series on them, but if more people are interested, that's something that we can look into as well. The differences between faction shields and engines. If you learned anything useful today, or if you had a good time, please don't be afraid to drop a like. If you're feeling friendly, maybe go ahead and subscribe. But either way, have a fantastic rest of your day, and we will catch you next time. Thanks for watching.